Hey everyone, welcome back to another support counter matchups video. In this one, we're going to be going over junglers. So just like all our other videos, we have the same layout. In this case, let's take Ares. We're going to have Ares counters, and he's going to counter the characters up here. We're going to have neutral characters, characters that we think are going to be neutral into whoever we're talking about. And then, of course, we're going to have characters that we think counter the character that we're talking about. And so it's important to note, just like with every other one, that it's not necessarily about the categorization, but it's about the knowledge that I'm talking about. You know, what we're talking about. You guys can make your own categories by yourselves. Like if you don't think a character belongs in the counters category, that's completely fine. If you think they belong in another one, that is completely fine. But it's mostly about just learning about the matchups and then making your own decisions behind it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First off, we're going to go over Ares. So pretty much just like in every other video, Ares is going to counter characters that have dashes, right? So a majority of these junglers up here, they all have dashes. Kali, Nemesis, all of these characters. Some of them also don't have CC immune alts, which is another plus for Ares. So like Nemesis, Susano, right? Like they get countered heavily by Ares. Some of these other characters too. So a lot of these characters, or pretty much all of them, are going to have dashes to some extent and rely on these dashes. And that's why I put them under the Ares counters them category, because he counters anybody because of his cripple field, or not his field, sorry, his cripple chains. He's going to counter anybody that has a dash because they need that ability to get out, to do stuff. And of course, him locking down their escape means that they can't use an entire 1/3 of their kit or 1/4 of their kit if you count their ult throughout like the duration of the cripple, which is pretty massive. Under neutral, we're going to have characters that don't really rely off their dashes nearly as much, right? Like Tsukiyomi doesn't have one, Arachne doesn't have one, Loki, Pele. These characters don't have one. Bakasura and Mercury do, but they also have a little bit of extra like play to them, not just their dashes. Bakasura has a really nice ult he can catch Ares in, and Mercury also has a really nice ult too to be able to start fights and kind of get out. Mercury's also slow immune as well with this too, so he can actually get away from Ares chains a little bit easier than say some of these other characters. In terms of counters Ares, Thanatos. So Thanatos is a one that's going to be interesting because Ares doesn't have an escape, right? Ares is considered an immobile character. And so whenever you're support, especially one like Ares, where you need to engage or you want to engage for your team, want to blink in there an ult or chain, you're going to be on the front lines, right? And so when you get in there and you don't have an escape, you're going to be taking a lot of damage, and Thanatos can abuse that, especially because Thanatos ult's about 40% HP execute threshold, which means that if they just shove 60% of your HP away, get you to 40% HP, Thanatos can just execute you. It's really hard for you to move around right on the front lines because you don't have any mobility. So that's why I think Thanatos is a huge counter, and why I hate playing tanks like Ares into Thanatos, because not only does Ares not do anything with his chains to Thanatos, and Thana can immune ult with his ult, but Thana can easily just kill Ares whenever he wants to, like at any point in the game, as long as the enemy team is doing damage to him. And Ares is going to be in a position where he's going to get damage put on him because he wants to engage, right? He's going to be on the front line. So that's why I think Thanatos is a really, really good counter to him. Ravana, a little bit less so of a counter, but the thing about Ravana is that he doesn't really care about Ares chains again, right? He's got his flip. But he also has some CC, some lockdown for Ares, so he's going to have his root, and he has his slow as well. It's going to kind of like mess with Ares a little bit, and he doesn't really care about Ares, so not as big of a counter, but still a counter in my opinion nonetheless. And Naja's kind of the same way. Naja's going to have a lot of lockdown, right? Naja's slow on his 1. He's gonna have his 3, which is a massive stun that can't be crippled out, right? It's like one of the only, I guess, like dashes in the game that can't really be crippled. I don't know if they classify it as the dash, but regardless, it can't be crippled. And on top of that, he can also ult Ares and set him up. And again, Ares not having any mobility, even if he lives when he comes back down from the Naja ult, he's gonna kind of get ganged up on by the enemy team. So that's why I would consider these 3 to be counters to Ares. But yeah, that's kind of where I would put the jungle matchups versus Ares in these categories. All right, so Artio is gonna be very similar to Ares. Again, you have your cripple field, right? So you're going to counter anybody that has the dash. That's the big thing about Artio. Pretty much everything applies. The same with Ares. Every single character applies. But in terms of neutral matchups, I actually moved a lot of the neutral characters, or sorry, the counters Ares characters to neutral for Artio, because the thing about Artio is that she doesn't suffer the same thing that Ares does. So she has sort of like the same kit in the sense that she can cripple out people, right? And that's where the big counter is going to come from. That's why the counters are sort of the exact same. She doesn't have that massive ult that Ares does, but we're focusing more on the lockdown from cripples, and that's what she does have, right? A 6-second cripple field. But she also has a dash, she has a stun, and she has a slow to a root. So she's going to be way more mobile, and she's also going to be a little bit more versatile when it comes to CC and fights. So a lot of the things that sort of countered Ares before, like Thanatos and all that, because Ares didn't have a dash, Artio doesn't have that problem as much, because not only does she have a dash, but she also has sustain in her kit, right? She has healing and all that kind of jazz. So overall, because of that, she's going to have a little bit more safety than Ares, and I actually don't think anybody actually does counter Artio. At least not to a heavy extent. Now, you might disagree with that, and that's completely fine, But personally, like, whenever I play Artio, there's no matchup. I'm just like, oh man, I really, really hate this matchup. There's sometimes where it's like I get Fenrir ulted, right? But even then when I get Fenrir ulted, I mean, I counter like literally 2/3 of Fenrir's kit, or literally half of Fenrir's kit, whatever way you want to look at it, because he can't brutalize and he can't jump. So like, she does screw over Fenrir quite a bit. But like characters like maybe Daji and Aokwang, possibly. Aokwang can execute her and he'll be a huge counter to the Guardians, as you'll see later down the line. But she does have a lot of sustain in her kit, like I said, so it can be harder to get an execute off on her. And she can also just sort of counter Daji by preventing her from dashing and stunning her out of her too, all that kind of jazz. So overall, I think that there's not really going to be a heavy counter to Artio, mostly just neutral matchups, but she's going to counter about the same exact characters that Ares would counter because she prevents them from dashing away. All right, up next we have Athena and we have Horus. So, as in my other videos, I don't really think Athena counters too many people, and a Horus is going to be about the same exact way as Athena. Just because they don't have like they're really good at engaging, right? Athena dash taunt, like one of the best engages in the game, or probably the best engage in the game. Horus also has really good engage with his 2 stun and his 1 knockup, but like it's not going to be a tremendous amount of lockdown to the point where I'm like, okay, these characters counter these characters. It's mostly just gonna be really, really good engage. So I really don't feel like they kind of do everybody the same in the sense that like they engage on everybody the same. Now some characters are gonna be able to get out of the engage easier than others. For example, someone like Tsukiyomi, it's gonna be a lot harder for him to get out of engages because he doesn't have a direct dash, like versus like Nemesis that might be able to. So you have those kinds of plays here and there. And if you want to like categorize them differently, that's completely fine. But for the most part, I think I would just leave almost all these characters in neutral. I don't really think they hard counter anybody. But in terms of characters that do counter, so I have these spaced out a little bit. Lance, I think, is going to be a good counter to Athena, not because of his lockdown towards Athena, but because of his prevention from Athena's CC. Athena has a taunt. That's pretty much her CC. That's her main CC besides her slow. And Lance is immune to that on his horse. So Lance is immune to all CCs while he's on his horse, only while he's on his horse, don't worry, except for stuns. Stuns are the only thing he's not immune to. So if Athena wants to dash taunt a Lance, she can't, because Lance will be immune to the taunt while he's on his horse. So it's more of like a preventative measure. Now, obviously into Horus, he's not really gonna counter Horus, I don't think, because Horus does have his 2, and he has a really good way of like kind of getting Lance off his horse to stun him. But for the most part, Lance is gonna be a good sort of like prevention counter to Athena because she can't really engage onto him. Now, as for Bakasura and Awilix, these are gonna be good into Horus. Horus relies off 2 movement abilities, right? His 2 and his 3. And so Bakasura is going to be able to lock down those 2 portions of the kit because of his ult. His ult's a massive slow cripple field, kind of like a mini Cupid one almost that doesn't mez afterwards. But he's going to be able to lock down Horus from pretty much being able to get away. And Awilix is kind of the same thing. Horus's 3 is considered, you know, flight abilities. It's considered like a knock-up. So Awilix is going to be able to essentially pull him out of his 3 with her ult. So that's why these 2 characters, I think, would counter Horus. Wouldn't really counter Athena as much, I would say, but Lance is mostly going to be the counter to Athena here, again, because of prevention, and then Bakasura and Awilix are mostly going to be a counter to Horus because of their ability to sort of lock him down and sort of like pull him back in. All right, so next up we have Baron. Now, Baron's going to be really good at locking down characters that don't have movement abilities, because if he roots them, they can't get out of the root, right? They're essentially immobilized, and same thing with his ult, right? He can combo off root, and he can also ult, and they can't get out of his ult. So because of that, Baron's going to counter characters that don't have movement abilities, such as Tsukiyomi, Thanatos, Pele, Naja, Loki, and Arachne. He can 3 all these characters and they're kind of stuck in place for a while unless they're forced to ult out or something like that. Now, I did skip over Aokwang. Aokwang does have a movement ability, but Baron's root still hard counters it, because if he roots the Aokwang and Aokwang dashes away, not only is it doing tick damage, so it's going to reveal Aokwang's invis, but it also roots him in place after he dashes as well. And this will apply with some other characters too, like Merlin 3, for example. Merlin Flicker, if you get rooted by Baron and flicker away, you still get rooted afterwards. So it doesn't happen with every dash, but this interaction does happen with like some certain dashes in the game. And so that's why Aokwang is going to be here as well. In terms of the neutral matchups, these are just going to be characters that can easily get away from Baron. At some points even being able to kill him a lot, but just get away from his CC. Again, if you, it's just a root, it's not like it's a cripple, so if you have a dash or a movement ability, you can easily get out of the cripple, and same thing with his ult. So he's not really going to lock down any of these characters. Counters to Baron though, I'd say it's Lance. And again, Lance is mostly a sort of not going to have heavy lockdown towards, you know, these supports that we're talking about. He's mostly a preventative character. So Lance is immune to all of Baron's CC. Baron can't root him while he's on his horse, and then Baron can't pull him either while he's on his horse, and he can easily get his horse back off his ult. So like there's not really anything Baron can do when it comes to peeling Lance unless like his horse and his ult are down, but those are super conditional conditions. So there's not really anything that he's really going to be able to do to the Lance in terms of like peel or lockdown or anything like that. So that's why I would say Lance is mostly a counter to Baron because he can't really lock him down. Very similar to Baron, we're going to have Sylvanus. Almost the same logic here. He's going to be really good in the characters that, again, can't really get out of his roots or CC because he can easily root somebody like Tsukiyomi, for example, and then pull him. So he's going to be able to counter these sort of characters. But someone like Thanatos and Alquang might be like softer counters because these characters, like Alquang, can still sort of get out a little bit. And Thanatos also can look for an easy execute late game onto the Sylvanus. So you could honestly put these two under neutrals if you wanted to. I just sort of still have them under counters because Sylvanus' main kit is still really good into them, but they also have good kits into Sylvanus. So it's kind of like up to you where you decide to like go through there. Neutrals are going to be like mostly the same. Again, we're very similar here to Baron. The biggest difference I think is going to be the counters. So you have Kali, Erlong, Shen, Fenrir, and Serket. Kali because Kali can just run down the Sylvanus, right? A Hasten Katana or Hasten Fatalis Kali can just literally run down Sylvanus and ult and like, he can't really ever get away from her. She's also immune to some of his CC as well, especially while she's ulting. So she's going to be a pretty good counter, in my opinion, to Sylvanus. Erlong Shen's a little similar if he's building around the same way, and he's also, like, knock immune while he's in turtle form. So he's not going to be able to, like, he's going to be able to get away from some of Sylvanus' close range CC, and he's going to be able to run him down. I have Fenrir because Fenrir is really good at pretty much displacing targets, and we've talked about this in some of my other videos, but Sylvanus doesn't like to be displaced because he's an immobile guardian, right? So Fenrir can easily jump stun then ult to Sylvanus, or even ult to Sylvanus and wait for Sylvanus to ult, right? Play some mini games with them and then pick him up with his bite. But if he picks Sylvanus up with his bite and then like displaces him, right? Like Sylvanus is pretty much as good as dead because he's not going to have a way to recover from that displacement. Serket, because Serket is anti-heal, so she has 100% anti-heal part of her ult, so she engages on Sylvanus with a load of CC and then ults him and then kind of like throws him into her team. He's not going to be able to recover some of that HP with his heal because it won't exist because it's all countered. And so I think Serket's overall going to be a pretty decent counter to Sylvanus. Now, the reason why I didn't say put Serket as a counter to Baron is because Baron has a little bit of play against this because of his ult. Baron's ult grants him like 50% damage immunity, so he's able to actually mitigate some of that Serket ult, even though it's true damage. If you guys didn't know, you can mitigate true damage with percent damage mitigation. So he's going to be able to mitigate some of that and have an easier time kind of walking away. Sylvanus is more of a sitting duck. All right, so up next we have Ymir and Cabrakan, and the main way these characters are going to counter other characters are through their walls. And so they're going to be really, really good into characters that don't have leaps. So they can have dashes, or be immobile, not have an escape at all. If they have a leap, they're not going to counter them as heavily. So if you see here, we go to Ymir and Cab counters. We have characters like Mercury, Tsukiyomi, Nemesis, Pele, Naja, Arachne, Susano, Erlong, and Lance. None of these characters have leaps except for the Lance, and we'll go over him in a second. But none of these characters have leaps, and so their walls are really, really good at trapping them in. They're really good at engaging onto these characters and sort of preventing them from going where they want to go and really like dictating where they can go in a fight. So they have really, really good lockdown for these characters. Stuns and slows aside, their walls will prevent these characters from really being able to do what they want in a fight. Now, as for Lance, these characters are actually really good against Lance because he can actually jump over the wall, but then he's forced to use his horse to get over the wall, right? And so now his horse has been consumed, and it's actually easier to chase the Lance. On top of that, too, if Lance ults, you can wall off a Lance ult, effectively shortening the Lance ult's range, right, with your wall. So these characters are going to counter Lance for those reasons. In terms of neutral matchups, mostly characters that have leaps or can go through wall. Fun fact, Mom and Bridget's dash can actually go through walls, if you guys didn't know that, which is really cool, which is why she's under neutrals. It's like Ganesh 3, essentially. But yeah, all these characters are going to be able to get out of their walls some way, shape, or form. And then, of course, we have counters Ymir and Cab. So Kali and Thanatos are going to be really, really good in these characters. Thanatos, for the same reasons we talked about Ares earlier, they don't have any forms of mobility, right? Cab has his ones, it's kind of like a speed boost, but no forms of mobility. So Thanatos is going to be able to easily execute these characters late game. They should just be dead when he hits the ground. So Thanatos is going to be a pretty big counter to them, in my opinion. Kali is also sort of like the same way a little bit. More of a counter, I'd say, to Ymir than Cabrakan, but she's able to stick onto them pretty well. And I've always found it really hard to peel off a Kali whenever I do play Ymir. So like I said, it's more of a counter towards Ymir rather than Cabrakan, because Cabrakan actually has multiple ways to sort of deal with Kali with his stuns. But Ymir only has one stun, And if she beats that stun, she's also slow immune and all that kind of stuff with her ult to his other CC. So it's actually really difficult to lock down a Kali as Ymir. I've always found, at least, it's really hard for me to peel a Kali. So, and she also has Leap to get over as well. So that's why I think she's more of like a counter to Ymir rather than Cabrakan, because Cabrakan does have multiple ways to sort of deal with her. As for Alquang, this is going to be, in Daji, these are going to be more counters towards Cabrakan rather than Ymir. Obviously, Cabrakan doesn't have a CC immune ult, so Alquang is just going to be able to execute, right? Like, to deal with that, you either have to get beads, you have to go Magi's, or you have to go Absolution and somehow time your ult, right? It's going to be a lot more difficult, right, than it sounds. And same thing with Daji. She's going to be able to pull and displace him because he doesn't have a CC immune ult. So if you are into Daji, I would highly suggest getting like an Absolution maybe on Cab. If you are into Alquang, definitely go beads. People that tell you can't go beads on support, they're smoking something. Beads is completely fine on support. I win in a lot of my comp matches, and if it allows you to survive and keep playing the engagements and live to another day, then it's a good pickup. But only go it if you have to. That's the one aggravating thing about characters like Alquang or even Fafnir. Even if you watch SPL matches, it forces all 5 players to really get beads, unless you have like a crazy CC immune ult. Alquang can also be good into Ymir as well, but he's mostly going to be better into Cabrakan, I think. And while we're on the wall train, let's go over Yemoja. So just like the other characters before, Yemoja is going to be able to wall, block people in, trap people in. So she's going to counter mostly the same characters that Ymir and Cabrakan counter. She also has the Riptides that are able to zone out. They're like kind of mini walls. They're not really walls, but they do like zone out an area and knock people back, of course. But if they beads, they can walk through it. So they're sort of like along the same concepts. But so she's going to counter a lot of the same characters that Ymir and Cabrakan counter for that reason. Neutral matchups are going to be roughly the same, I think, except for the Daji, and I'll go over the Daji in a second, but I just want to go over the counters to Yemoja. So Thanatos, Alquang, and Awilix, I think all counter Yemoja. Awilix is one of her bigger counters because if you or your allies go through a Yemoja hoop, that's airtime, and Awilix can pull you out of that. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's really, really tough to actually play Yemoja into Awilix, especially in the early game where, before you get any of your prots and stuff like that online, it's really easy for Awilix to pick you off as Yemoja. Alquang, because Yemoja doesn't have a CC immune ult, so he can, as long as she's weak enough, he can execute her. And then Thanatos, kind of the same reasonings as other people. Yemoja does technically have an escape with a Riptide, but you have to travel to that escape. It's not instantaneous. Say, for example, like a Nemesis dash, right? So it's really telegraphed to where you're gonna go. So it's easy for Thanatos to sort of get an execute off. So that's why I would put these 3 under counters for Yemoja. As for neutrals, Daji, I would actually have a counter for Yemoja, but the thing about Daji is actually Yemoja plays pretty well into her depending on how you play Yemoja. So if Daji is ulting, if you place your Riptide at the ult location where the pillar is, and she pulls you and allies towards the pillar, all it's going to do is bounce you guys right out of it, bounce you guys right back. So it's actually really, really good. In some ways, Yemoja can actually be considered a counter matchup to Daji. I'm going to leave her neutral just because it's like, I think it's more of a neutral matchup. But yeah, just kind of keep that in mind. Whenever you're Yemoja into Daji, that's going to be one really, really cool trick that you can do. And then Serket, not really a massive counter in my opinion, just because even though Serket can block off healing, she can actually still get her shielding through. So it's actually still worth it to an ally because you're still giving them HP through shields, even if you're not giving them HP through health. And Kali, you could consider Kali to be countered by Yemoja, like up here in this category, just because Kali wants to sort of like commit with her ult, and then Yemoja can spam to and heal allies. So you could definitely consider that, but I think I'm just going to leave her as a neutral matchup because that matchup I think can play out in different ways. So next up we have Atlas. Atlas is going to be a character that really prides himself off his slows. So his slow lockdowns are going to be like really, really big things. Now his slows aren't really considered lockdowns, but they are towards more immobile characters. Atlas also can make himself slow immune with his dash as well, as long as they're within a certain radius of him. And so because of this is going to factor into some of his counters. He's going to be able to cleanse pretty much all of Nemesis's CC with his slows and really kind of screw up by slowing her. So I think he's actually a pretty decent counter into Nemesis. And Pele also hates slows, and Atlas has a ton of them. So Atlas, I think, is going to be really good into Pele because not only is he's going to slow her, but also, too, he can pick her up, and he's also knock-up immune while he's both dashing and picking her up. So she can't even, her main form of CC, which is her knock-up, she can't even use that onto Atlas or effectively use it onto him. And then lastly is Naja. Now, Naja is going to be less of a counter, I'd say, than these two. These two are more like harder counters. Naja does have his like sash, his his all and all that kind of stuff, but In terms of his ring bounce, again, it's not going to be, the slow's not going to be that effective versus Atlas because of his 3. And also, if Atlas like gets up close, it's easy to grab Naja, and of course be able to slow Naja. It's really easy to kind of go on Naja if he's slowed. So that's why I think Atlas is going to counter these characters. Now we have some of these characters on the neutrals. You could say the same exact thing for Tsukiyomi. I actually think Atlas is decent in Tsukiyomi, and same thing with Arachne as well. You could definitely put Arachne up into the counters category. Thing about Tsukiyomi though is that they gave him his knockup back, not his knockup, sorry, his knockup immunity back. So on release, he was knockup immune while he was channeling his 2. And then they took that away, and then they gave it back to him. So if he still didn't have that, then I'd say he probably is countered by Atlas. But because of that, Atlas is really good at getting, you know, around and through his cattle traps because he's slow immune. But it's harder for him to pull the Tsukiyomi because he's knockup immune. So that's why I kind of put some of these here. Arachne is also another one I think that is actually, Alice is actually probably pretty good into. She just has like different ways to get out with her ults. And also she has like a really quick stun now ever since they buffed it. So if you want, you could put Arachne getting countered by Alice, but I kind of just leave her under neutral. And then same thing with a lot of these other characters too, just other ways to get away. In terms of counters Atlas, Bakasura, because Bakasura has a big cripple field, and Atlas hates cripples, and so he can slow and cripple Atlas as well, especially if he's trying to run away, because Atlas's dash is way easily more catchable than like other dashes in the game because it's a bit slower. Ao Kuang, because Atlas doesn't have a CC immune ult. Same thing with Daji and Fenrir, all 3 of these because he doesn't have a CC immune ult. I would say though that Absolution is really good on Atlas, so if you're facing characters like this that have strong ults into a Guardian that doesn't have a CC immune ult, then Absolution, if they can use it well, is the way to go. Atlas uses Absolution very, very well. I talked about it in my Ares video as well. Ares counters him, but if you Atlas proc Absolution, because it procs off like the first tick or whatever of your ult, which is kind of cool. So if you get Absolution on him, it'll be really, really good into characters like Daji and Fenrir. And then Lancelot, because more of a, again, not really lockdown, but more of a preventative countermeasure, because Lance can't really get CC'd by Atlas if he plays his horse correctly and whatnot, so it's really hard to peel Lance off of your allies as long as he's on the horse. All right, I want to get these 2 out of the way. You guys already know Bake is absolute ass. He's dog shit in support. Same thing with Charon. These characters are bad. They're not going to counter anybody. They don't do anything well. I hate these characters. I'm sorry. I just don't think they're effective at all. I don't hate them. I just don't think they're effective at all. Most of these are going to be neutral matchups. They don't really have any lockdown for anybody. So again, they don't really counter anybody. As for characters that do counter them, Thanatos, because both their dashes are pretty like sort of short. Bake has a short dash, easily catchable by Thana ult. Charon's dash is going to be longer, but kind of slow on the more slow end. More like an Artio dash and all that kind of stuff. So it's, again, easily catchable, I think, by Thana ult. Ao Kuang and Fenrir and Daji are all going to be very good into Bake because he doesn't have a CC immune ult. Easily, so AO can easily execute him, Fenrir can easily grab him and displace him. Same thing with Daji, can easily grab him with her chains and displace him. So these 3 are going to be really good into Bake. I wouldn't consider them counters to Charon, but mostly counters to Bake, and then Thanatos is just going to be counters to both of these. All right, next up we have Cerb and Bacchus. Now, these characters specialize in anti-heal, right? Cerberus has anti-heal as his passive, and he can also heal steal from people, which is really cool, making him a little bit more sustainy. And then Bacchus also has anti-heal. Now, none of these characters have super heavy lockdown. Bacchus does have a flop into a stun into, like, Bacchus has a lot of CC himself, but the duration of the CC isn't going to be as long as some others in some of the DRs itself as well. But both of these characters are going to be really good into characters, obviously, that rely a lot off either lifesteal or ability-based healing. So I think they're good counters into someone like Ao Kuang, Camazotz, Pele, and Thanatos, all because they heal. Thanatos is a little bit of more of a softer counter because Thanatos can actually really screw these characters over. But dude, if you've ever played Cerberus and you fought a Thanatos and he death sights you, you just get so much HP back and it feels amazing. It feels so good. So I think these characters are going to be more of like, not necessarily lockdown counters, but more of like softer counters to all of these characters. Like Cerberus and Bacchus are going to be more softer counters to all 4 of these characters here, just because they rely a lot off like healing and lifesteal, like Pele does, especially as well. Same thing with Ao Kuang, that it's really going to kind of screw them over when they get jumped on by, especially like Bacchus, who has a lot of like CC in his kit alone, and also the anti-heal factor. Neutral matchups are not really going to care as much about this, and also have ways to sort of like get away and whatnot. You could make an exception for someone like Set and put him on their counters if you wanted to, because Set does rely off healing. Same thing with like Kali a little bit, but I don't feel like they have like enough lockdown for these characters that I call them like direct counters. Again, these are mostly soft counters, not going to be really hard counters to them. So like they're counters in my opinion, but like to a certain extent, right? Not like, oh, this is unplayable. This, like, I wouldn't want to play this into this character. In terms of counters Cerberus and Bacchus, Wheelix, because both Cerberus and Bacchus have leaps, right? Just kind of like Yemoja from earlier. Because they have leaps, Wheelix can easily pull them back in, especially Bacchus. She's very, very good into Bacchus. I would hate playing into an Wheelix's Bacchus. And then Bakasura, because he has this cripple, so it's like he's able to prevent them from jumping out, prevent them from really moving around and stuff like that, because it's a slow cripple field. So both these characters, I think, are going to be pretty good counters into Bacchus and Cerberus. Fafnir and Xing are going to be really, really good into auto attackers. So these characters were literally made to counter auto attackers, especially Fafnir. Fafnir has a disarm that prevents people from auto attacking for a while, as well as, you know, 3 other stuns. So he's got a lot of CC. He actually has 2 disarms if you count Dragon Form disarm as well. It's like an AoE one. And then Xing is gonna have the damage of auto attackers by like 50%, right? So Xing is gonna be really good into auto attackers as well. So because of this, naturally they're gonna counter auto attackers. So when it comes to junglers, Kali, Nemesis, Erlong, Pele, Bakasura, Arachne, Set, and Mercury are all super heavy auto attack characters. Pele a little bit less so. She toggles on more abilities, but her ult is considered an auto attack, and Fafnir can disarm her while she's in her ult and prevent her from really getting those ult shots off. So it's really, really good. Fafnir is especially good into Kali, and pretty much like all these characters. So these are all going to get countered by Xing and Fafnir because they rely a lot off auto attacks to do the main portion of their damage, and Fafnir and Xing counter their auto attacks. Neutral matchups don't have that problem, right? They're more ability based, so they're not really going to care as much. Counters for Fafnir and Xing, Wheelix. Just like with our other leap characters, right? Cerberus and Bacchus. Fafnir and Xing both have leaps. They rely off leaps to get around, to be mobile, and Wheelix can displace them and pull them right back in. So I'd say she's going to be the main counter to these characters out of all the assassins. Also, as a quick note, I also do think Faf is actually fairly good into Lance, because Lance has a like, he uses his horse to essentially be mobile and be immune to a lot of stuff, but because Faf has a lot of stuns in his kit, he's able to get Lance off his horse, because again, Lance's horse is only, it's CC immune to everything except stuns. So he's able to actually pull Lance off his horse quite a bit. So you could definitely make an argument for Lance being someone that gets countered by Fafnir in particular, but I kind of have him under neutral because there's just like other things that play other parts of his kit, like his cripple. It can be good into Fafnir, all that kind of jazz. So that's why he's under neutral. Ganesh specializes in countering dive. He's made to counter dive essentially, and what do assassins want to do? Well, they want to dive and kill your backline, your carries. Ganesh is going to be one of the most annoying characters versus that, and so he's going to counter most assassins on this list, most of them being ability based or channel based characters because of Ganesh's silence. So he's going to be really, really good into all these characters. He's really good into Naja in particular, because Naja wants to sash in, and after sash wants to do things like ult, but Ganesh can easily just silence the sash location, like silence his ally, so Naja can't follow up with an ult right afterwards, and you guys can actually just blow him up. So he's gonna have some form of like massive counterplay to all these characters. Nemesis, he can cancel out her shield, prevent her from dashing. Fenrir cancel out the brutalize. Serket cancel out the one. Like, he just cancels so much stuff out. Loki cancels the invis, right? He's just so good at locking down all this dive. So even like Mom and Bridget, like if she goes into somebody, he can silence the location, just like with Chernobog on a wall. And when she wants to dash out, it puts her on the floor because her dash gets canceled by his silence. So like, he's just able to cancel all this stuff out, which is just why he's going to be so good into these characters. In terms of neutral matchups, characters that don't care as much about the silence, he still does well into these characters, don't get me wrong. They just don't care as much about the silence, I don't think. Like Tsukiyomi, and like Tsukiyomi has a lot of range play. He can definitely cancel out Tsuki too. So you could be like, oh, Dash, he cancels out Tsuki too. Yes, but Tsuki has his cattle traps that remain on the floor for a while, and he also has a lot of range play with his auto attacks. And so because of that, I kind of felt the need to just like, hey, let's just slap him under neutrals. You could also make an argument for Daji being countered by Ganesh, and I think that's completely fine to make. The only reason I have her under neutrals is because of her ult, and she can like pull him in. Now, if she does, obviously, if she is doing that, get your beads, get your absolution on Ganesh is fantastic. Get absolution if you want to instead of beads. Or both. But yeah, he's still going to be really, really good into her. And then for counters Ganesh, to be honest with you, I don't really feel like too many or really any assassins counter Ganesh. The only one I could really think of is Ao Kuang. And the reason being is because, again, Ao Kuang punishes Guardians in particular that don't have CC immune ults because he can execute them pretty easily. And also, too, when Ao Kuang activates, I think it's his 2. Whenever he activates the dragons that go around him where he can, like, auto-attack and, you know, they hit enemies after he auto-attacks, once he activates that, that can't be, like, that's not, like, a channeled ability that can be canceled out. Like, essentially turns into an auto attack ability based damage character, if that makes sense, when that happens. So Ganesh can't really silence that once he activates it, you know what I mean? So he's still going to be able to get all that damage off. So it's a mixture of like that, as well as, you know, being able to ult Ganesh, that I actually think he's going to counter Ganesh to a certain extent. But overall, I don't think that anybody's going to too heavily counter Ganesh, because again, Ganesh is really built for this. He's made to counter these characters. He is made to counter assassin dive and protect his backline. But if it was going to be anybody, I would think it would be Ao Kuang. Very similar to Ganesh, another really good anti-diver is Kumba. So Kumba is actually going to be good in pretty much all assassins, because most assassins want to get up close. But Kumba is especially good into assassins that want to get in your face, and that are auto attack based. And so with that, he's going to counter characters like Kali, Nemesis, Erlang Shin, and Pele. And the reason being is because these characters all rely off auto attacks to a certain extent, and want to get in your face. And Kumba's Mez is really, really, really good for that. Not only can he like Mez people that, you know, go onto him or onto his allies, but on top of that too, once the Mez is broken, there's still movement speed and attack speed slowed after the mez. Not if the mez goes through its whole duration, doesn't get broken, but like if you mez them and say somebody hits them while they're being mez, they get that additional debuff after the mez, right? After the mez breaks. So it's going to be really, really good into auto attack based characters. And then of course Kumba has this too, and some other forms of CC, a lot to counter dive. Kumba is especially good into a character like Kali, because the thing about Kali is that she wants to get in there, she wants to do some damage, get weak, and then she wants to ult for extended, you know, duration and heal up. Kumba essentially shuts that down, because the second Kali ults, just ult her. If you ult a Kali ulting, it completely screws her game over. So not only is this Mez going to be very good into her, but then you just ult her while she's ulting, and your ally can walk away, or even better, you and your allies can set up the second she lands, just kill her, right? So that's why Kumba's going to be very good into these four, but especially into the Kali. Neutral matchups, like I said, Kumba I think is good into everybody. I think he's just especially better into some of these more auto attack based characters. Like Mercury's auto attack based, so is Set to a certain extent, but like Mercury has some slow immunity in his kit and all that kind of jazz, and he has like different ways to play around it, I think. But yeah, they're mostly just gonna be neutral matchups, I think, just because they don't get like heavily countered by the Kumba. And then for counters Kumba, just Lancelot, again, more of a preventative measure, but Lance can't really get CC by Kumba. The Mez doesn't work on his horse, and neither can his 2. Now, of course, if Lance is off the horse, yes, you can CC him, but if Lance is playing around his horse correctly, it can be really hard to peel against the Lance. You can't even ult the Lance. I think if you ult the Lance, like nothing happens. He just takes like a little bit of damage to his horse shield, that's it. So Lance literally has every way with his horse to deal with Kumba CC. And then also you can make an argument for some of these other characters like Ao Kuang that can execute Kumba, and also Thanatos that can execute Kumba. You can definitely make an argument that they counter Kumba, but I think for the most part, just leave them under neutral matchups, because Kumba does make it hard for them to sort of play the game around him as well. And next up we have Geb. So Geb, I don't think, how can I put this? I think Geb is a good character. He's got a decent kit, but I don't really like having Geb on my team that much. Geb is going to be very good into characters that rely off some form of CC, like heavy, like single target, mostly CC. And Geb is going to be really good into them because he can cleanse those CCs with his shield. So Ao Kuang, he can cleanse actually Ao Kuang ult, if you guys didn't know that. So Ao Kuang ult starts off as like a stun, and from a stun goes into pretty much like a banish, I guess. Where he executes the person. Now you can actually, I made a video about this, but you can actually cleanse Ao Kuang ult with Khepri ult. So because Khepri ult's an initial cleanse, so you can actually cleanse the person out of Ao Kuang ult if you want to. But Geb can do the exact same thing with the shield. You just have to time it right. And you can actually prevent them from getting Ao Kuang ulted, and it, you know, eats Ao Kuang's ult, it consumes it. So that's why he's going to be good into Ao Kuang. Daji, because you can shield one of the chains from Daji. Serket, you can shield her taunt and also her ult, and what's cool is the shield's going to eat like pretty much all of Serket's ult damage as well. So it's actually not only going to like cleanse them from the ult's CC, but it's pretty much going to eat the entire damage, or most of the damage. Fenrir, because you can cleanse people either out of his jump, or better yet, his ult. If you pick somebody up, you just shield them. There you go. Like it's really good in the Fenrir. Naja, because again, you're going to be able to cleanse out of Sash. And of course, Thor, You can cleanse people from the wall poke, right? Thor really wants to wall somebody, then sort of like poke him out with his hammer. You can cleanse that person. You can also cleanse them from his dunk as well. Now, of course, you're only cleansing one person, so if he gets a massive dunk, it might be a little troublesome. But regardless, all these characters rely off like their CC to a certain extent to really play the game, and Geb is really good at cleansing it. Mostly the single target CCs though too. So for neutral matchups, you're not really going to have that as much. They're mostly just going to kind of like be there, and you know they're still going to get affected like pretty hard by Geb's like stun and all that kind of stuff, but like they're not going to care as much about his shield as say like these characters would, for example. And then characters that counter Geb, the only one I can really think of realistically is like Bakasura. Bakasura, because he has a cripple field, again, that is really good at like locking down, that can lock down Geb and prevent him from getting away. But at the same time, too, Bakasura has to be relatively close, so Geb can ult the Bakasura. So this one's even controversial, to be honest with you. But that was really the only one I could really think of if there were any counters to him. You could easily put Bakasura on a neutral if you wanted to, and that's completely fine. I don't think anybody would argue against that. But I just said he counters Geb because there are ways for him to sort of screw over Geb if he gets a really good ult on him. And then, of course, Thanatos can also be good into Geb because, you know, execute works based off HP, not shielding. So even if you shield somebody that would theoretically put him temporarily over like 40% HP, that's not going to matter to Thanatos. He doesn't care about that. And so it's like it can be actually beneficial for him to like get a nice execute off on someone that's shielded. But again, it's like we're really like grasping at straws here, I think, and that's more of like a neutral matchup overall. Next up, we have Khepri. He's another really good backline support. Khepri is also another support that's really built and made to counter assassins, counter dive. He's really good at buffing his allies and of course preventing them from dying with his ult and setting up a character here or there with his one and his root as well. He also buffs allies with his passive as well because it gives them shields. So in my other videos, Khepri, I don't say really counters too many people. In fact, almost nobody, even though he's really good in general. But Khepri is going to counter a few assassins here, and it's going to be Tsukuyomi, Pele, and Kali. And the reason why these three in particular is because they're more all-in committal assassins. Pele is going to hard commit, right, with their kit, with their ult. Kali as well wants to like jump in, commit with their ult. And same thing with Tsukuyomi, wants to commit with his ult. And Khepri is really good at preventing all-in commits because Khepri denies the kill, right? He reses his ally. So when that happens, you know, Kali ult's now gone. It's like, oh, now Kali dies because she doesn't even get the heal for the kill anymore because the person did die. Pele wants to come in and commit with her ult, and then Khepri just, you know, reses the person. Same thing with Tsukuyomi. And he can even like two people from Tsukuyomi's like ult to really reduce the damage of it as well. So like he's gonna really punish these characters because they're more all-in committal kind of characters. And they don't have as much safety. And these people under neutrals because there's a little bit more play to them. Now, there are some like characters here like Serket. I think Khepri is really good in Serket. I wouldn't label her like directly countered by Khepri. I do think Khepri has a lot of play into her, especially because he can 2 his ally that gets ulted. And then, remember what we said earlier, percent damage mitigation reduces true damage. So whenever he 2s his ally, they get 30% damage reduction, at least as of the making of this video. And with that, it's going to reduce their ket all by 30%, the damage on it. So I do think like Khepri definitely has like a lot of play into pretty much every assassin. Like he's good into all of them. I just think he's going to hard counter these three in particular. In terms of counters, Khepri, Thanatos and Alquang, more for the obvious reasons, right? They can execute through Khepri ult. So even if you ult somebody, Thanatos, Alquang are going to be able to execute them. Now, as I said earlier, Khepri does have a little bit of counterplay to Alquang because you can actually cleanse somebody out of Alquang execute if you time it right. So there is that. If you can time it right, it is a bit hard to do. I've done it a few times. It is still good, but nevertheless, Alquang's still going to be really annoying into Khepri because there's always that threat. Thanatos, obviously, you can't cleanse any of that. It's all up to Thanatos whether he misses his ult or not. Hopefully he does, but if he doesn't, then like your ally is going to go bye-bye. Daji, because Daji can kind of pull him in. Khepri, in my opinion, doesn't use Absolution that well. So if you are going to opt in for some sort of CC immunity option, same thing with Fafnir too, by the way, because he can like pull him. But if you are going to opt in for a CC immunity option, you're going to want to go like Magi's or Beads. And then like, you know, Fafnir displaces with his ult. So that's why I think all these characters counter him. These mostly deny his ult, and then these are good at displacing him in like bring him out of his sort of like his comfort zone. I've said this before, but the thing about Khepri is Khepri wants to remain with his backline, like with his carries are behind them to give them good repositions when he ults them and also to buff them with his 2. And so like these characters are, and also to sort of like get away from them because people want to target the Khepri. They want to focus the Khepri. They either make him like screw up his ult or make him ult himself, which sometimes isn't the worst, but you know what I mean. People want to focus the Khepri. So Daji and Fafnir are going to be good at sort of like getting like getting him and displacing him, bringing him to their backline essentially. So that's why I think these characters are all counter Khepri. Now Kuzenbo's an interesting one because I don't think Kuzenbo hard counters really anybody. Kuzenbo is his main thing is if somebody has tick damage, it's gonna and you pop your 2, you're gonna get your cooldowns back like almost immediately because of the way his kit works. And also too, if they have tick damage, you have better reflex. Same thing with like heavy auto attack. So Kuzenbo, I think, is going to counter Tsukiyomi and Daji because first of all, Tsukiyomi and Daji just have a lot of tick damage, right? Daji has taken pretty much every single portion of her kit. Tsukiyomi has his cattle traps and other like like damaging aspects of a singular ability. And so I think Kuzenbo is actually going to be pretty good in these characters, or really good into them, just because he's going to be able to pop his 2, get a little bit of extra damage off, and of course get his cooldowns back like almost immediately. So he's able to push these characters around a lot, especially the Tsukiyomi. I've actually found it really, really easy to mess with the Tsukiyomi as Kuzenbo. And then Kuzenbo is going to counter Merc because Merc typically, whenever you see him, almost always wants to build crit. And so his auto attack is going to be hitting really heavily, but if he's punching Kuzenbo that has a bunch of reflect, it might not be so pretty for the Merc. So Merc I think is a bit more of a softer counter. I think Tsukiyomi and Daji Kuzenbo counter is a little bit harder than Merc, but there's obviously argument in play to both. In terms of neutral matchups, it's just going to be characters that aren't going to proc his 2 as much, aren't going to proc his tick as much, or like hit as hard. You can make an argument, say like, oh, Nemesis can go crit, and if she does, it's like, yeah, it's kind of similar to Merc. Sure, definitely, you can kind of put her up there, but it's more conditional. Merc is more like Merc's pretty much going crit just about every single game, like in jungle, unless someone's like heavily experimenting with the build. Nemesis has like a lot more variability with the way she builds, so just kind of like keep that in mind. But yeah, I think for the most part, these are all going to be like more neutrals. And then counters Kuzenbo, Bakasura, Thanatos. Bakasura mostly because he has a cripple, right? A cripple field, so it's going to prevent Kuzenbo from dashing away. Kuzenbo hates cripple fields. And then Thanatos, because even though Kuzenbo has a dash, it's a little bit more easily to dive just because it's a bit of a shorter distance. So I think it's like easy for Thanatos to sort of like catch up to the Kuzenbo. And then same thing with like the Ao Kuang. Ao Kuang's just going to be able to ult him. Now, Kuzenbo does have a CC immune ult. But the whole reason I put Ao Kuang in here is because at least in terms of my matchups, Ao Kuang still, not all the time, but in a lot of cases is still able to get me after I ult. Like they play it pretty well. So this is a little bit more like argumentative. Like you could put this more neutral, the Ao Kuang. I think it all just sort of depends on your experience, like the players that you've gone against. But yeah, I'd say like Ao Kuang maybe is a bit more of a neutral matchup, but I still think like he does have some counters to Kuzenbo to a certain extent, just because like if he does play around his ult correctly and does actually like wait for Kuzenbo all that kind of stuff, like he is kind of a sitting duck. So next up we have Sobek, and Sobek's gonna be really, really good at displacing people with his 1. That's gonna be his main thing. And so whenever you displace an immobile character, it's really hard for them to recover, right? And so with Sobek, Tsukiyomi, Thanatos, Nemesis, Pele, and Naja, in my opinion, are all going to get heavily countered by him because it's really, really hard for him to recover after getting plucked. If you pluck Tsukiyomi out of position into your team, like, good luck, right? Same thing with all these other characters. Nemesis does have 2 dashes, keep that in mind, but the thing about Nemesis is that her dashes are a little bit easily more calculated, I'd say. And she does have 2, so like each dash is a little bit shorter than like a normal dash would be because she does get 2 of them. And he also has his tail whip to be able to knock them out of her shield and out of her dash a little bit as well. So I think like overall, he's actually going to be like still really, really good into Nemesis. But yeah, for the most part, these characters have a much harder time recovering from a Sobek pluck than, say, for example, a lot of these neutral characters would, which have a little bit maybe more counterplay, like Arachne has her spiders, all this kind of stuff. So, and they have dashes, all that kind of stuff. So I think like these characters are going to get heavily countered by Sobek. And then in terms of characters that counter Sobek, biggest one I can think of is Bakasura, again, because of that cripple field. It's really, really good. Also, too, he summons minions around him in the cripple field. So that can be a little annoying, and those minions, too, Sobek might accidentally pluck those. I'm not saying that's like a big reason for the counter. He already can't pluck in the cripple field alone, but it's just something to, like, to consider. It's a little bit on the funnier end, I guess. But yeah, for the most part, I think like Bakasura would be like Sobek's probably biggest counter out of all the characters here. So up next, we're going to have Terra. Now, Terra specializes sort of in a little bit of lockdown because she has a ranged stun and she has an AoE route that she has to dash into essentially to get. And she also has a little bit of lockdown with her auto attacks because they slow. And she also specializes in buffing her allies as well. But she doesn't have like a tremendous amount of lockdown. Nothing that's going to be like a lot of lockdown over time. So she's not going to lock down too many characters in my opinion. But I think she is really, really good into characters that don't really have escapes, again, are sort of immobile because the CC that she does have is good at like kind of keeping those characters in place. So again, you have the AoE root, and that's going to go ahead and root any immobile targets and essentially make them rooted in place, right? So here you're gonna have Tsukiyomi, Pele, and Arachne because none of these characters can really get out of that. You also obviously have your stun, which is kind of nice, and of course if you leave your 3 up or any rocks up, you can go ahead and slow people with your auto attacks. So because she has those auto attack slows and the root and the stun as well, I feel like she's best going to be able to lock down characters that are already immobile, meaning like they don't have dashes or anything like that. So that's where these 3 kind of come in mind. Now you do have a couple over here in the neutral category, such as Loki and all these kinds of characters, but the matchups just don't feel the same as they would, I feel like, with Tsukiyomi, Pele, and Arachne, especially with like the way Loki plays a little bit. He's a little bit more sneaky, in my opinion, and I feel like these characters have a little bit more play to them as well to help counter out the Terra. So because of that, these characters are going to kind of be under the counters. But of course, you can always mix and match these characters depending on how you see it as well. And then for characters that counter Terra, it's going to be the obvious ones that we've gone over. Bakasura because he has a AoE cripple field. Ao Kuang because she doesn't have a CC immune ult, so he's going to be able to execute her. Daji, same thing. But Terra does use Absolution really, really well, so just kind of keep that in mind. I would definitely try to go Absolution on Terra whenever you are into, say, like Daji, for example. Magi's beats in the Ao Kuang. But yeah, Daji because she can pull her, and also Serket because Serket just has anti-heal. So you kind of combine all those factors together. I feel like these 4 characters are the best at countering Terra out of all of them. And then last but not least, we have Maui. So Maui is an interesting character because Maui has a lot of CC. He has a lot I've said this before, but Maui has the most displacement out of any character in the game. His passive is a displacement, his 1's a displacement, his ult's a displacement, and technically his 2 is also a displacement if you consider displacing your allies a part of that kit because he can teleport allies to him. So he's going to have 3 to 4 displacements. So he is actually going to be still really, really good into characters that don't have mobility, like Pele and all this kind of stuff because of his displacements. Although I wouldn't say he super heavily counters those characters. I kind of put him more under like a neutral matchup. I don't really feel like it's like, oh, this guy can't play the game. I've never really felt like that with Maui into some of these junglers. In terms of actual characters that Maui counters, I would say Fenrir. And the reason why is because Maui, first of all, his 1 is really good at locking down Fenrir and pulling him in, of course, but like Fenrir has 2 movement abilities. So Fenrir really, really gets screwed over by cripples. And Maui's going to cripple Fenrir out of like his 1 and his 3, so he can't jump or move around. And then, of course, if Fenrir does jump in, he also has a stun that he can go up into the air and just like stun Fenrir out of his brutalize and just out of all that kind of stuff. So cripples are really, really good into Fenrir, and it's really hard for him to get out of those. And so because of that, I think like Maui is, and also too with all the other CC, I think Maui's just gonna be really, really strong into him. And he also has like multiple ways to banish himself as well, Fenrir ults, so he can kind of get out of those. And then of course, like I said, for the neutrals, mostly just like I think he's actually good into almost all these characters to a certain extent, but they just don't feel like they get nearly as heavily countered as say someone like Fenrir would. In terms of countering Maui, Bakasura preventing him from getting his jump off. It's always Maui. Funny enough, like just like Fenrir hates getting crippled out, Maui hates getting crippled out as well. So Bakasura is going to screw him over. And of course, if he is able to get that jump off, Wheelix is going to be really, really good into him because Wheelix can actually pull him out of his 3. So both of these characters are pretty much denying his escape, just in different ways. And if you deny Maui's escape, he's just a sitting duck, and it's really hard for him to, of course, like recover from that. So both these characters are going to be very good into him, and I think they're going to hard counter Maui. That is going to be the entire list for supports versus jungler matchups, guys. I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned a lot of stuff. Again, not important as much for the categorization. More important to actually learn and understand why these characters get countered the way they do. And if you think something else, by all means, put in the comments and we can talk about it. That'd be awesome. But guys, thank you all again so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Hope you all enjoyed this video, and until next time, see ya.